Hello again, world! I'm the Rip-Off Artist, here to take a deep dive into the game we all know as The Force Unleashed 2. Released in 2010, 2 years after the first game, The Force Unleashed 2 was widely regarded as a disappointment and a cash grab that pointlessly extended the story of the first game. Boy, were we so naive back then. Oh, how standards have changed. But given worse things have come out since The Force Unleashed 2's release, was the disappointment justified? Back in the day, I'm sure people thought this was the peak of Star Wars video game disappointments, and it probably held that title for at least 5 years until, well, you know. Now, as I'm the guy who constantly seeks to improve, I want to improve from my review of the first game by talking about all versions. That includes the HD, SD, and DS versions. I will be playing the HD version on my PC because it's the easiest. So first I want to talk about the DS version. It's crap. It's basically a touchscreen slashing nightmare, and the controls aren't very good. I only played like 10 minutes of it before I switched it off. Okay, so that's the DS version reviewed. Now let's talk about the other two versions. The more interesting versions. The Force Unleashed released on all systems at the time, and the same is true for the sequel, but given the PlayStation 2 was out of commission, the standard definition version was of course on Wii, and only on Wii. Given the Wii console is an entirely different system to the modern consoles at the time, the Wii version is an entirely different game, built from the ground up independently from the HD version. I wanted to talk about both versions simultaneously. Both versions start the same. An exciting title crawl telling us, the audience, that since the events of the first game, the Rebel Alliance, though organized, are scattered and the Empire is still in control, with Darth Vader coming up with a scheme to destroy his apprentice's legacy. And as the promotional material pointed out before release, we're not playing as Starkiller, but rather a clone of him, Subject 1138.
He said it!
Now, unlike the Rise of Skywalker, that used clones without care, this game actually takes time to clarify that cloning Force users is no easy task, and this story, from what I've been told, is akin to other stories with cloned Force users. They all made it clear that the cloning process for Force users is imperfect and leads to disastrous results, like the clones of many Force users in the expanded universe became insane and caused more harm than good. What Vader is trying to do here is perfect the ideal clone of his apprentice to serve him. But in The Rise of Skywalker, it's just that cloning was a secret only the Sith knew, which goes to show how little J.J. Abrams knew about Star Wars. It was just OT and nothing else. The clone of Starkiller, released from captivity, discussed how he has the memories of his template. Basically, Vader treated Starkiller like shit, keeping him locked up for 13 days. No better than the original, and he gives Starkiller 2 lightsabers instead of 1, and some droids posing as rebel troopers to fight. But immediately after this is where the two versions start deviating. In the HD version, any chance of build-up is ruined when they task the player with killing droids posing as Juno Eclipse, Starkiller's love interest. There's numerous of them, and they all give the Starkiller clones loud flashbacks, and eventually, when confronted with the last droid posing as Juno, Starkiller can't get himself to do it. In the Wii version, this is way better. You start off by killing droids, posing as rebel troopers, and they slowly build up to Starkiller being confronted by the droid posing as Juno Eclipse. And story-wise, it makes more sense, because Starkiller wouldn't know it wasn't the real Juno in the HD version, based on how the story is presented to the player. And that's something I wanted to talk about for this review. Does The Force Unleashed 2 have a good story? The opinion of those who have played both versions, the general sentiment is that The Force Unleashed 2 on Wii is the best version, and I heavily agree with that, and I wanted to explain why. In both versions, Vader says that Starkiller has failed and is to suffer the same fate of all the other clones before him. In the HD version, Starkiller finds out he'll be killed immediately because of a vision to the first game of Vader betraying him, while in the Wii version, the reveal is done much better when he impales the droid posing as Juno, causing both an effective fake out and an effective reveal at the same time. These changes may seem minor, but the Wii version paces the story a hell of a lot better than the HD version. Starkiller manages to escape, and if you've played the HD version, you know it's basically Starkiller falling from the sky, force pushing everything in his path. This is a poor sequence because there's no strategy. Just press the force push button over and over again and you'll be fine, I promise ya. The Wii version, on the other hand, has you start your rampage to escape. There's also a clear difference in the combat. First, let's talk about the HD version's combat. It's very janky to sum it up in one word. Clearly the HD version was rushed, because it's nowhere near as smooth as the original game, and the HD version was made on the same damn engine. Obviously they had to create new animations for a dual-wielding Starkiller, and I'm gonna say firsthand that it was so much simpler with one lightsaber. It's hard to describe what the combat gets so wrong, because it's something that's not easily talked about. You kind of have to just play the game to see the difference. I think the lackluster combat has a lot to do with the weaker sound effects and the feeling of hitting enemies. It kind of feels like we're merely scratching an enemy with nunchucks. It's a very weird feeling. It doesn't help that the enemies and force powers aren't much good either. First, let's talk about force powers. The powers in this game feel slower and sloppier. The dash button doesn't feel as if it goes that far, and sometimes there's instances where I barely make a jump to the next platform, because I easily could have died. Force push on its first level was way too weak. When you level up force push, it's not so bad, but on the first level, you push at a less frequent rate. And I also felt like the force push ability was too focused, if that makes sense. Like, it's less like the wind and more like actually pushing someone with both hands. Then we've got force lightning. Not only is the combo during lightsaber attacks with it suck, but the lightning is just bad. I only use it to drain enemies' health. Given there are no health bars for enemies in this game, unless it's a boss, I never get an idea of how much damage I'm doing. It's not the worst power in the world, but I felt insanely underwhelmed. I kind of felt the gameplay made the player underpowered. Throughout the first mission, I think you're introduced to a lot of enemies that should have been saved for later levels. For example, the riot droid with a shield and a carbonite dispenser. I think this enemy is way too tough and should have been introduced later, because you'll fall into the beginner's trap of assuming that you can use the force to escape when you're frozen, when in actuality, if you're frozen too much, you're as good as dead. The shield the enemy has is near useless, and you can rip it away with force grip. I guess you could say that you have to take some time away from other enemies to rip it off, and I guess that's true, but it's still not fun. But let me make a distinction. There are far worse games I have played, so don't go thinking the Force Unleashed 2 is that bad. I gotta say that it's a very adaptable game. If you start playing it beginning to end, which you can easily do in a day, you can easily adapt to its crap factor, as I did later in the game. Now I want to talk about the Wii version of the first level. First, I gotta say, the level has something the HD version doesn't. Proper atmosphere, because Kamino looks and feels more like Kamino as presented to the audience in Attack of the Clones. That being a mysterious, hidden off place where the Empire is doing experiments. The lighting is better because it's dark like it's supposed to be. It's moody. I noticed how Kamino sounded compared to the HD version. The Wii version has atmosphere across all the levels. Next, let's talk about the combat. First thing to say is that it's much smoother and more natural compared to the HD version. To be honest, the feel of the lightsabers is sorta like the HD version, but without the jankiness. It doesn't feel clunky one bit, and there's more of a punch to the hits. Given this version was adapted solely to the Wii, they have to take advantage of the function of the Wii controller. You have to play this game with a nunchuck and motion controls, and the sensor are parts of the gameplay. For example, when it comes to, say, Force lightning, you have to hold Z on the nunchuck and shake it sporadically to generate lightning. This is perfectly acceptable, even if your hand gets tired easily. Also, a notable change between both versions and how the level plays out is that Vader is constantly on your tail in the Wii version. You see, in the HD version, Vader is never seen until the end of the level, whereas in the Wii version, at every quarter or so of the level, he manages to catch up to you, and you are forced into a quick time event. And here, it actually works. Quick time events are usually just button mashes, but here, you must actually have quick reflexes and a lot of shaking strength to get past these. Like in this one example, Vader shows up, and you actually have to have quick reflexes to complete this. Like shake the Wii controller right, then down, then shake the Wii remote and nunchuck as hard as you can, up and down. It's actually one of the few quick time events that were done quite well in any game ever. Also, collectibles are desirable because they aren't overtly hard to find, and the rewards feel more meaningful. A small change in the Wii version I liked was having the lightsaber and power crystals be separate entities instead of combining the two. That way, we don't have to pick a certain color for a certain ability. I'd say that the Wii senses reactivity is pretty solid. It's not easy for the Wii system, and they did quite well. Also, on the Camino level, I wanted to talk about this one part in the HD version where you do nothing but dash from a gunship firing at you. I would complain about the villain kills his own men cliche, as stormtroopers are caught in the crossfire, but then I realized the Empire would not want Starkiller getting off-world. Lastly, I wanted to talk about how the mission ends. In the HD version, you knock a pillar over by throwing 3 TIE fighters into it, and then you get infinite force rage, which is powerful, but feels just as clunky as normal combat. Also, the first time I played this, the game glitched as the next cutscene wouldn't load, and it seems like every future cutscene wouldn't load either. It was strange, whereas in the Wii version, it's another high-tension quick-time event, and it feels more like unleashing the Force than the HD version. With that, we escape Darth Vader and steal his TIE Advanced. Now, in the first cutscene, Vader told us that Ram Koda was captured and held hostage on Cato Nemoidia, which is Starkiller's next step. So the next cutscene starts with Ram Koda killing 2 generic gladiators no one cares about. We can clearly see that he's been trapped there for a while, based on his appearance. Also, I'd like to say that his power is demonstrated when he says to the main antagonist of this level,
"You're running out of executioners,
Baron Marilyn Taco, and no, I didn't mean like the Mexican taco. Although in my younger days I made a lot of jokes about that. However, the Baron Taco is closer to looking like Vladimir Putin than any Mexican I've ever seen. I know some of you might not be brave enough for politics, but you'll get the gag. Baron Taco has a Russian accent, at least according to Gaming Sins, which I guess is Variety, because it was mostly the British when it came to the Galactic Empire. Now we've got enemy number 1 for Americans, those stinking commies. Okay, enough jokes about Russia, let's get on with it. For starters, a Nemoidian incorrectly informs Baron that Lord Vader has arrived. And since the game was kind enough to give us enemies to fight at the very start, Baron says that he'll assemble a stormtrooper squadron in the hangar. So he goes down to meet Lord Vader, but to his surprise, a probably late teenager steps out in an Imperial flight suit.
I was expecting Lord Vader.
The Jedi. Where is he?
Oh, he's alive. For the moment. He's been in the arena for 7 days. What are the Imperial security codes for this sector?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the stupidest combination I ever heard in my life. That's the kind of thing an idiot would have on his luggage.
Congratulations, you've just obtained level 5 clearance. Come on in.
What you got is what we need, and all we do is dirty deeds. We're the space balls. Watch out, we're the space balls. We're the masters of space.
Dude, don't mess around.
With the space balls.
So of course, Starkiller's off to doing another rampage by igniting his lightsaber and killing everyone in his path. Now, comparing the HD and Wii versions, the level design is different, although both levels have similar aesthetics. The Wii version is much more varied, as it has you traverse noticeably different parts of the Cato Nemoidian city. Also, it's here where I say that the Wii version introduces enemies at a paced rate far better. In the Wii version, this is where you first encounter the security droids with the shields, and I always agreed with the Wii version when it came to how it introduced enemies. In the HD version of this game, this is when the game starts really becoming tedious. The gameplay, if I could describe it in one word, would be hindering. The game absolutely feels like the enemies slow you down immensely. In the Wii version and the original game, there was a natural flow of killing enemies and making it one step forward in the level. Like, how to describe it is that the HD version is essentially tedious because the combat doesn't exactly grind stuff to a halt, but it's sort of like when you're going 100 miles an hour and you hit the brake as hard as you can and it's doing its best to slow down the car, and that moment when you slow down is essentially the HD version's combat. So now, I wanted to talk about the train sequence. In the Wii version, it's just a quick time event. Simple, yet effective. In the HD version, well, first you have to blow up some useless TIE fighters, and next, an Imperial dropship tries to take you out, and you have to deflect all of its attacks. I never usually like it when the only way of damaging something, or at least the most practical way, is to just use the block button. This is exactly like deflecting bolts in Fallen Order, except it's your only option instead of one of many. Plus, on my computer, the default block button I just hated. You see, on PC, it's pressing the scroll button on the mouse, and damn was this annoying. I mean, I could have just changed it, but I was too lazy. Okay, so I'm not actually going to criticize the game for this, because I was the lazy one. I just hope that on console, that the block button is better mapped by default. You see the difference in the train part? In the HD version it's so tedious, but in the Wii version, you'd enjoy it as much as Thomas the Tank Engine as a child. I know I did. I was the kid who could name every single train. Anyways, in the HD version, you go around killing more stormtroopers until that bloody gunship comes back to be the biggest pain in the ass. But at least you're only protecting yourself instead of the train's health as well. So we destroy the gunship and we finally get to Ram Koda. If you're wondering what the Wii version is like after the train, it's basically progressed through hordes of enemies, the most basic trope of a video game. Also, you need to do some parkour, which is sort of annoying, but there's a great sense of satisfaction once you're fully up. So Ram Koda and Starkiller talk, and to be honest, it's rather unimpressive. But I guess the upside is that the dialogue isn't, "I thought you were dead," or something cliche like that. The impatient Baron, who taunted us the entire level, makes perhaps the most reckless and final decision of his life. He tells his servants to release the Gorog. What's a Gorog? Well, at first I thought that as well in my first ever playthrough. I mean, the Rancor that at first appears to be the boss, I assumed was the Gorog, but oh how you subverted my expectations. It's this enormous abomination. Given the two were unveiled the same year, the Gorog is way scarier than the Zillo Beast, and unlike the Zillo Beast, it's actually believable, because even though it's large, it's vulnerable to the right combatant. So in both versions, we dodge the Gorog's attacks, and cut its hands and arms, and then we're supposed to attach it to a chain that it will try to rip off and lose more health. Of course, design-wise, these two fights are exactly the same, but given the Wii version feels better, that's of course the better version, albeit slightly, given both boss fights are essentially the same. In the Wii version, we do a quick time event to give the Gorog a sore eye, but there's no eye drops around. It makes the Gorog even more angry, and it goes ballistic on the arena. Of course, design-wise, these two fights are exactly the same, but given the Wii version feels better, that's of course the better version, albeit slightly, given both boss fights are essentially the same. So on the communicator, which I suppose Starkiller gave Ram Koda off-screen or something, I mean, it's a contrivance, but it's a human error. This would just be nitpicking. Anyways, Ram Koda tells Starkiller to bring down the structure, so we do just that. The sense of tension is greater in the Wii version, and because on top of the atmosphere I mentioned earlier, the Gorog in the Wii version can actually grab you, and you'll be forced into a quick time event to escape, so it keeps you on your toes. Bringing down the structure, Baron becomes a happy meal for the Gorog, and being fussy, he decides he wants the Ram Koda burger too, but given McStarkiller came all this way to save Ram Koda, he's not gonna let that happen. So in the HD version, we fall from the sky, and it's really tedious, but in the Wii version, it's all just a cutscene after you bring down the structure. And that was the right call. It didn't need to be stretched out to a free-falling boss fight. I never really did like it when that sort of stuff happens in video games anyways. So we rescue Ram Koda and escape in the Rogue Shadow, which I guess was the original Rogue One now that I think about it. I mean, they took Starkiller's first name for a character too, and stole his general name for Starkiller Base, without credit. Those dirty plagiarist scum. Anyhow, Ram Koda establishes how he's disconnected from the rebel fleet, and it's here where Starkiller's main motivation is laid out here. He wants to find Juno, and cares little about the rebel alliance that his template created. So I wanted to talk about this. Given this is the midpoint of the game, Starkiller's motivation is not very complex or interesting. It's essentially the same motivation that Super Mario has. Get the girl. Now, in a lot of stories, a lot of protagonists who end up obsessed with only one thing make for rather weak protagonists. Not exactly bad necessarily, but far from interesting. An example of a character who shares this rigid writing structure is Connor from Assassin's Creed 3. For context, Connor was a Native American Mohawk who was motivated by pretty much two things at best: protecting his people and killing Charles Lee, the man he thought had wronged him for killing his mother. The whole game, Connor doesn't seem to have much of a complex reasoning, and his character never evolves from just angry and bitter. In fact, he learns that Charles Lee did not kill his mother, but instead his ally, George Washington, did. And how does Connor react to this plot twist? He just persists with killing Charles Lee, and George Washington gets little more than a slap on the wrist, and Connor ceasing to help him directly with the American Revolution. A war that the Patriots are already pretty much winning anyways. Also, he's a constant dick to other people, and at the end, his people are driven out by manifest destiny anyways. So his goal is surmised to essentially
Nothing! You lose! Good day, sir!
In fact, Connor is so unlikable that his enemy should have been the protagonist instead. So how does this relate to Starkiller? Well, he's got the same problem. A rigid motivation, and he doesn't evolve throughout the story at all. If you're going to make a sequel to the first game, you could at least bring something mind-blowing to the table like the first game. If the first game was about Darth Vader's secret apprentice and the origins of the rebellion, this game could be about something maybe? Nothing is coming from the top of my head, but a paid writer should be able to come up with something. So since both have no idea where the rebel fleet is, Starkiller decides to go meditate, and the discussion about this has Ram Koda object to it, and also question the fact that he's a clone, which the game alludes to the possibility that Starkiller in this game may not be a clone. From an expanded universe perspective, that might actually be true, but since Disney canned The Force Unleashed 3, and what we got in its place was essentially crap, I guess this mystery will remain a mystery, but nobody's happy except J.J. Abrams. I didn't want to talk about this much, because I think it would have been more relevant in the third game, a game that never was, so this thread is just limbo. Anyways, since Ram Koda suggested either Kashyyyk or Dagobah, where does Starkiller go? Does he go to the planet he's familiar with, the place that his template grew up on, at least at first? Nope, he goes to Dagobah. To be fair, Kashyyyk is Imperial space, so of course going to Dagobah, we explore the swamp a bit before the next cutscene where we meet Yoda of all characters. In the Wii version, the swamps are very much more atmospheric, and feels even better than what it did in Empire Strikes Back. That is some high praise right there. But point being, I want to point out the sequence of Dagobah is much longer than the HD version, whereas the HD version in actual gameplay goes on for less than a minute, barring some collectibles. The Wii version actually has you explore the caves through gameplay. And god did this improve the damn level. There's no combat in the cave, but just like in Empire Strikes Back, we get to see many illusions and other scary fun stuff. One of which being the evil Starkiller in the mirror. Mirror, mirror on the wall. This is where you learn the mind trick ability also. Yeah, I know, pretty late compared to the HD version, but Mind Trick in the Wii version is more useful anyways. My favourite part of the Dagobah cave sequence is that part where an illusion of Vader shows up, and he even is directly behind Starkiller, but of course when he turns around, there's nothing. Anyhow, the level ends with Starkiller seeing a vision of the future, where Juno and the rebel fleet will be attacked. So Starkiller goes and picks up Ram Koda from somewhere off screen, and they go to the rebel fleet. Two things that confused me is why the rebel fleet wasn't warned about the incoming attack in the vision, and why Ram Koda didn't tell Juno that Starkiller, or at least the clone with the same memories, was with him. And yeah, there's a line in the game right before the attack where Ram Koda essentially says, "It'll be better if she sees you first." And it was thrown in just for dramatic effect. Because, you know, this is a story. It would have been better if Ram Koda actually had no communication with Juno specifically, but I guess it hardly matters anyways, because guess who shows up? Yeah, it's Bobby Fat. In an earlier cutscene, he was teased to be in a later level, with Vader supplying him with Terror Troopers and a large spider droid. So of course, we're too late to save Juno, and I guess they kinda undid one of the first game's deaths, because look who's back. It's Kazdan Paratus, here to help the rebels fight the Empire, and I'm just kidding, it's Proxy. I don't know why they brought him back. He contributes virtually nothing to the story, unless he was going to be essential in the third game, but he no longer has the impactful role he had in the first game. He's just a character they brought back for no reason. So with that, Starkiller needs to find Juno, and stop that damn bounty hunter. Also, remember how I said that the cliche "I thought you were dead" line was avoided? Well, you can't have nice things because both Starkiller and Proxy say that to each other. So as a new enemy, we've got those tiny little spider drones. I hated fighting these guys in the HD version, but in the Wii version, they're the type of common fodder enemy type you would encounter in a game. Like, for example, the grunts in Halo. But on a larger scale, I guess the spider flood forms would be more accurate. I don't even remember much from the HD version, and going over the footage, I remember why. There's nothing memorable. It's just a tedious slasher that would make even Jason Voorhees retire. I'm going to say that the level design in the Wii version is just so much better. The lightning, for one, gets the horror aspect across, and two, the presentation is better. In the HD version, Boba Fett gets away with Juno, and Starkiller goes on to fight the giant spider droid, and it's very hollow. Whereas in the Wii version, you actually get a quick time event that makes it feel like Starkiller was actually trying his hardest to save Juno. So when it comes to the spider droid fight itself, in the HD version it was, you guessed it, tedious. You basically have to use force grip to pull things away and out, and other monotonous stuff. Compare this to the Wii version. You use force lightning and simple timing to stun the droid with the core, as you can see on screen. Simple, easy, and most of all fun. It's also after this that you are introduced to Force Rage. Yeah, this is way more overpowered than Fury in the HD version. You just select targets and they die in a cool compilation of insta-kills. I can see why this was introduced late. It's also here where we meet incinerator droids. As you can probably guess, they both show up in the same general level, and they're basically very similar to the security droid, except they shoot fire instead of carbon. Also, they're not as annoying. I'm also going to say that around the halfway point of the Salvation level in the HD version, I fully adapted to this game's crap factor. In the Wii version, you have a cool team up with Ram Koda, which was a definite highlight of the game. It's akin to Anakin and Obi-Wan being buddy cops in Attack of the Clones, at least at the Coruscant speeder chase. Also, I wanted to talk about Starkiller deciding to crash the Salvation into Kamino to break through everything. In the Wii version, it's a simple quick time event, but in the HD version, it's a tedious timing nightmare, where if you fail, you start from the very beginning. And given the ship is slow to get at the end, you will be frustrated if you fail. But since Starkiller dying is boring, at least in this context, we survive and continue on with the last level, Return to Kamino. This level is okay in the HD version. Of course, it doesn't have the atmosphere of the Wii version, but it's still probably the best level. Although I'm not sure whether or not that's influenced by the "my god, it's almost over" feeling. In the Wii version, it feels like a return to the start to finish the fight feeling I got in Wolfenstein The New Order. It began there, and it's going to end there. Go back and do what you need to do. There is a new enemy type in this final level, that being Starkiller clones, and accurate to the expanded universe, they're all insane, which is what happens when you try to clone Force users. I'll talk about this more in Dark Force Rising in the Last Command, but for now, I'd just like to say that the Wii version had me on the edge of my seat. Let's discuss the final boss fight, and the stark contrast between the versions. Let's start with the HD. In the HD version, it feels very tacky and slapped on and feels too much like it was scripted. The game can't immerse me. The Wii version, on the other hand, starts with the scene where Vader holds Juno by force grip and forces Starkiller to surrender. Now, there's actually something about this scene that the HD version does better. When Vader demands that Starkiller do his bidding, at the threat of Juno's life, he complies, but Juno tries to fight Vader, and he throws her far away and knocks her out, which gets Starkiller enraged and sparks the final boss fight. This is the HD version. In the Wii version, after Vader ungrips Juno, Starkiller immediately attacks Vader. It's a small detail, but it changes a lot in the moment of the story. Also, the HD version's depiction is far more in character for Starkiller, because I don't think he'd risk Juno's life at any point. It's only after she's met harm that he attacks in the HD version. Aside from that, the final boss fight in the HD version is bleh. It basically ends with an insane amount of lightning unleashed at Vader, which cripples him. In the Wii version, the quick time event is much more, well, cinematic I guess, and looks more like how Starkiller would defeat Vader in a Force Unleashed movie. I'm saying that I prefer the Wii version. So of course, after the game's done, we of course get a choice like the original game. Vader is at Starkiller's mercy, but Ram Koda steps in and heavily requests that Starkiller spare him for the time being, put him on trial, interrogate him, and then execute him. So it's either spare him or let him live. First, let's start with Starkiller's canonical choice. Let Vader live. So this is practically the fairy tale happy ending. Juno is okay, and Starkiller and Juno rekindle their romance. The alliance is fine, and Vader is captured. But given A New Hope exists, it probably won't last for long, but oh well. We've got The Force Unleashed 3 to anticipate. Oh yeah, I forgot. The game ends on a sort of cliffhanger, given Boba Fett follows the Rebel fleet. So that's the light side ending. Let's talk about the dark side, where they have cookies. Basically, this happens.
Psych! That's the wrong number!
So it turns out Vader had already perfected another apprentice. So Starkiller kills Starkiller, and Starkiller collapses as Starkiller looks at him, and Starkiller looks one last time at Juno and dies as Vader tasks Starkiller with hunting down Starkiller's Rebel Alliance. The subject of DLC, or more specifically, the Endor DLC, which I haven't actually played, but there's a good reason for that. The PC version doesn't have the DLC open for purchase, it's just the base game. And for what I've seen, the Endor DLC has a ton of plot holes, as they've just skipped so many events because in the previous game, they already did A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back locations. The DLC is completely batshit from a story perspective, but not completely faulty. I cannot say any more about it, given I am unable to play it. Now that there's nothing left, I wanted to ask the question, is The Force Unleashed 2 underrated? Given this question mostly relates to the HD version, I'd say no. It's still a crappy mindless slasher game, but it wasn't terrible. It's probably just a bleh game. Despite that, I would have very much anticipated a Force Unleashed 3. But since that game never was, I wanted to discuss a topic more interesting than The Force Unleashed 2 being underrated or not. That being how the gameplay and presentation can greatly affect a game and the player's enjoyment. I've made it no secret throughout this review that I have a high view of The Force Unleashed 2 on Wii. So this begs the question, did The Force Unleashed 2 actually have a good story? Maybe it was a good story that was presented badly in the HD version. Or maybe it was a bad story that was presented well in the Wii version. These two versions have made me wonder how many mediocre or crap game stories would have actually been regarded as good had the gameplay and presentation been better. Like maybe even Battlefront 2 EA. could have been an enjoyable story. If first, they hadn't falsely marketed the game, and second, the gameplay, presentation, content, and variety was improved. I may not have even complained about it in the first place. I think The Force Unleashed 2 is a special case, because there are two versions that contrast each other in quality, but essentially give the same product in many ways, but not always. I think both versions should be played by both game designers and reviewers alike, because it reveals a lot about both gameplay and story in a video game. I'm not sure whether to call The Tale of The Force Unleashed 2 a good story, but you'll get two different answers depending on the version. The fact that I have nostalgia for one version, but not the other, says something, I think. I can't put my finger on what, but The Force Unleashed 2 is a special case indeed. So that's my review of The Force Unleashed 2 as a whole. I give the HD version a 5 out of 10, and the Wii version an 8.5 or 9 out of 10, and the DS version, I give it a pi out of 10. So to wrap up this video, here are my patrons on screen. Now, I put out a poll asking for the next game review, and the winner was Battlefront 2 2005. So expect that sometime after my Dark Force Rising review. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Water was running, children were running, you were running out of time. Under the mountain, a golden fountain, were you praying?